Chapter 17 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. A Four Winds Winter. Winter set in vigorously after New Year's. Big white drifts heaped themselves about the little house, and palms of frost covered its windows. The harbor ice grew harder and thicker until the Four Winds people began their usual winter traveling over it. The safe ways were bushed by a benevolent government, and night and day the gay tinkle of the sleigh bells sounded on it. On moonlit nights Anne heard them in her house of dreams like fairy chimes. The gulf froze over, and the Four Winds light flashed no more. During the months when navigation was closed, Captain Jim's office was a sinecure. "The first mate and I will have nothing to do till spring except keep warm and amuse ourselves. The last lighthouse keeper used always to move up to the Glen in winter, but I'd rather stay at the Point. The first mate might get poisoned or chewed up by dogs at the Glen. It's a mite lonely, to be sure, with neither the light nor the water for company, but if our friends come to see us often, we'll weather it through." Captain Jim had an ice boat, and many a wild, glorious spin Gilbert and Anne and Leslie had over the glib harbor ice with him. Anne and Leslie took long snowshoe tramps together, too, over the fields, or across the harbor after storms, or through the woods beyond the Glen. They were very good comrades in their rambles and their fireside communings. Each had something to give the other. Each felt life the richer for friendly exchange of thought and friendly silence. Each looked across the white fields between their homes with a pleasant consciousness of a friend beyond. But in spite of all this, Anne felt that there was always a barrier between Leslie and herself, a constraint that never wholly vanished. "I don't know why I can't get closer to her," Anne said one evening to Captain Jim. "I like her so much. I admire her so much. I want to take her right into my heart and creep right into hers, but I can never cross the barrier." "You've been too happy all your life, Mistress Blythe," said Captain Jim thoughtfully. "I reckon that's why you and Leslie can't get real close together in your souls. The barrier between you is her experience of sorrow and trouble. She ain't responsible for it, and you ain't. But it's there, and neither of you can cross it." "My childhood wasn't very happy before I came to Green Gables," said Anne, gazing soberly out of the window at the still, sad, dead beauty of the leafless tree shadows on the moonlit snow. "Maybe not. But it was just the usual unhappiness of a child who hasn't anyone to look after it properly. There hasn't been any tragedy in your life, Mistress Blythe, and poor Leslie's has been almost all tragedy. She feels, I reckon, though maybe she hardly knows she feels it, that there's a vast deal in her life you can't enter nor understand, and so she has to keep you back from it, hold you off, so to speak, from hurting her. You know, if we've got anything about us that hurts, we shrink from anyone's touch on or near it. It holds good with our souls as well as our bodies, I reckon. Leslie's soul must be near raw. It's no wonder she hides it away." "If that were really all, I wouldn't mind, Captain Jim. I would understand. But there are times, not always, but now and again, when I almost have to believe that Leslie doesn't like me. Sometimes I surprise a look in her eyes that seems to show resentment and dislike. It goes so quickly, but I've seen it, I'm sure of that. And it hurts me, Captain Jim. I'm not used to being disliked, and I've tried so hard to win Leslie's friendship." "You have won it, Mistress Blythe. Don't you go cherishing any foolish notion that Leslie don't like you. If she didn't, she wouldn't have anything to do with you, much less chumming with you as she does. I know Leslie Moore too well not to be sure of that." "The first time I ever saw her, driving her geese down the hill on the day I came to Four Winds, she looked at me with the same expression," persisted Anne. "I felt it, even in the midst of my admiration of her beauty. She looked at me resentfully. She did indeed, Captain Jim." "The resentment must have been about something else, Mistress Blythe, and you just come in for a share of it because you happened past. Leslie does take sullen spells now and again, poor girl. I can't blame her, when I know what she has to put up with. I don't know why it's permitted. The doctor and I have talked a lot about the origin of evil, but we haven't quite found out all about it yet. There's a vast of ununderstandable things in life, ain't there, Mistress Blythe? Sometimes things seem to work out real proper like, same as with you and the doctor, and then again they all seem to go catawampus. There's Leslie, so clever and beautiful you'd think she was meant for a queen, and instead she's cooped up over there, robbed of almost everything a woman'd value, with no prospect except waiting on Dick Moore all her life. Though, mind you, Mistress Blythe, I dare say she'd choose her life now, such as it is, rather than the life she lived with Dick before he went away. That's something a clumsy old sailor's tongue mustn't meddle with. But you've helped Leslie a lot. She's a different creature since you come to Four Winds. Us old friends see the difference in her as you can't. Miss Cornelia and me was talking it over the other day, and it's one of the mighty few pints that we see eye to eye on. So just you throw overboard any idea of her not liking you." Anne could hardly discard it completely, for there were undoubtedly times when she felt, with an instinct that was not to be combated by reason, that Leslie harbored a queer, indefinable resentment towards her. At times this secret consciousness marred the delight of their comradeship. At others it was almost forgotten. But Anne always felt the hidden thorn was there and might prick her at any moment. She felt a cruel sting from it on the day when she told Leslie of what she hoped the spring would bring to the little house of dreams. Leslie looked at her with hard, bitter, unfriendly eyes. "So you are to have that too," she said in a choked voice. And without another word she had turned and gone across the fields homeward. Anne was deeply hurt. For the moment she felt as if she could never like Leslie again. But when Leslie came over a few evenings later, she was so pleasant, so friendly, so frank and witty and winsome, that Anne was charmed into forgiveness and forgetfulness. Only she never mentioned her darling hope to Leslie again, nor did Leslie ever refer to it. But one evening, when late winter was listening for the word of spring, she came over to the little house for a twilight chat, and when she went away she left a small white box on the table. Anne found it after she was gone and opened it wonderingly. In it was a tiny white dress of exquisite workmanship, delicate embroidery, wonderful tucking, sheer loveliness. Every stitch in it was handwork, and the little frills of lace at neck and sleeves were of real Valenciennes. Lying on it was a card, with Leslie's love. "What hours of work she must have put on it," said Anne. "And the material must have cost more than she could really afford. It is very sweet of her." But Leslie was brusque and curt when Anne thanked her, and again the latter felt thrown back upon herself. Leslie's gift was not alone in the little house. Miss Cornelia had, for the time being, given up sewing for unwanted, unwelcome eighth babies and fallen to sewing for a very much wanted first one, whose welcome would leave nothing to be desired. Philippa Blake and Diana Wright each sent a marvelous garment, and Mrs. Rachel Lynde sent several, in which good material and honest stitches took the place of embroidery and frills. Anne herself made many, desecrated by no touch of machinery, spending over them the happiest hours of the happy winter. Captain Jim was the most frequent guest of the little house, and none was more welcome. Every day Anne loved the simple-souled, true-hearted old sailor more and more. He was as refreshing as a sea breeze, as interesting as some ancient chronicle. She was never tired of listening to his stories, and his quaint remarks and comments were a continual delight to her. Captain Jim was one of those rare and interesting people who never speak but they say something. The milk of human kindness and the wisdom of the serpent were mingled in his composition in delightful proportions. Nothing ever seemed to put Captain Jim out or depress him in any way. "I've kind of contracted a habit of enjoying things," he remarked once, when Anne had commented on his invariable cheerfulness. "It's got so chronic that I believe I even enjoy the disagreeable things. It's great fun thinking they can't last. 'Old rheumatiz,' says I when it grips me hard, 'you've got to stop aching sometime. The worse you are, the sooner you'll stop, maybe. I'm bound to get the better of you in the long run, whether in the body or out of the body.'" One night, by the fireside at the light, Anne saw Captain Jim's life book. He needed no coaxing to show it, and proudly gave it to her to read. "I writ it to leave to little Joe," he said. "I don't like the idea of everything I've done and seen being clean forgot after I've slipped for my last voyage. Joe, he'll remember it and tell the yarns to his children." It was an old leather-bound book filled with the record of his voyages and adventures. Anne thought what a treasure trove it would be to a writer. Every sentence was a nugget, In itself, the book had no literary merit. Captain Jim's charm of storytelling failed him when he came to pen and ink. He could only jot roughly down the outline of his famous tales, and both spelling and grammar were sadly askew. But Anne felt that if anyone possessed of the gift could take that simple record of a brave, adventurous life, reading between the bald lines the tales of dangers staunchly faced and duty manfully done, a wonderful story might be made from it. Rich comedy and thrilling tragedy were both lying hidden in Captain Jim's life book, waiting for the touch of the master hand to waken the laughter and grief and horror of thousands. Anne said something of this to Gilbert as they walked home. "Why don't you try your hand at it yourself, Anne?" Anne shook her head. "No, I only wish I could, but it's not in the power of my gift. You know what my forte is, Gilbert, the fanciful, the fairy-like, the pretty. To write Captain Jim's life book as it should be written, one should be a master of vigorous yet subtle style, a keen psychologist, a born humorist and a born tragedian. A rare combination of gifts is needed. Paul might do it if he were older. Anyhow, I'm going to ask him to come down next summer and meet Captain Jim." "Come to this shore," wrote Anne to Paul. "I'm afraid you cannot find here Nora or the Golden Lady or the Twin Sailors, but you will find one old sailor who can tell you wonderful stories." Paul, however, wrote back, saying regretfully that he could not come that year. He was going abroad for 2 years' study. "When I return I'll come to Four Winds, teacher," he wrote. "But meanwhile Captain Jim is growing old," said Anne sorrowfully, "and there is nobody to write his life book." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Spring Days. The ice in the harbor grew black and rotten in the March suns. In April there were blue waters and a windy, white-capped gulf again, and again the Four Winds light begemmed the twilights. "I'm so glad to see it once more," said Anne on the first evening of its reappearance. "I've missed it so all winter. The northwestern sky has seemed blank and lonely without it." The land was tender with brand new, golden green baby leaves. There was an emerald mist on the woods beyond the glen. The seaward valleys were full of fairy mists at dawn. Vibrant winds came and went with salt foam in their breath. The sea laughed and flashed and preened and allured like a beautiful, coquettish woman. The herrings schooled, and the fishing village woke to life. The harbor was alive with white sails making for the channel. The ships began to sail outward and inward again. "On a spring day like this," said Anne, "I know exactly what my soul will feel like on the resurrection morning." "There are times in spring when I sort of feel that I might have been a poet if I'd been caught young," remarked Captain Jim. "I catch myself conning over old lines and verses I heard the schoolmaster reciting 60 years ago. They don't trouble me at other times. Now I feel as if I had to get out on the rocks or the fields or the water and spout them." Captain Jim had come up that afternoon to bring Anne a load of shells for her garden, and a little bunch of sweetgrass which he had found in a ramble over the sand dunes. "It's getting real scarce along this shore now," he said. "When I was a boy there was a plenty of it, but now it's only once in a while you'll find a plot, and never when you're looking for it. You just have to stumble on it. You're walking along the sand hills, never thinking of sweetgrass, and all at once the air is full of sweetness, and there's the grass under your feet. I favor the smell of sweetgrass. It always makes me think of my mother." "She was fond of it?" asked Anne. "Not that I knows on. Dunno's she ever saw any sweetgrass. No, it's because it has a kind of motherly perfume. Not too young, you understand. Something kind of seasoned and wholesome and dependable, just like a mother. The schoolmaster's bride always kept it among her handkerchiefs. You might put that little bunch among yours, Mistress Blythe. I don't like these boughten scents, but a whiff of sweetgrass belongs anywhere a lady does." Anne had not been especially enthusiastic over the idea of surrounding her flower beds with quahog shells. As a decoration they did not appeal to her on first thought, but she would not have hurt Captain Jim's feelings for anything, so she assumed a virtue she did not at first feel and thanked him heartily. And when Captain Jim had proudly encircled every bed with a rim of the big, milk-white shells, Anne found to her surprise that she liked the effect. On a town lawn, or even up at the Glen, they would not have been in keeping. But here, in the old-fashioned sea-bound garden of the little House of Dreams, they belonged. "They do look nice," she said sincerely. "The schoolmaster's bride always had cowhawks round her beds," said Captain Jim. "She was a master hand with flowers. She looked at 'em and touched 'em so, and they grew like mad. Some folks have that knack. I reckon you have it too, Mistress Blythe." "Oh, I don't know. But I love my garden, and I love working in it. To potter with green, growing things, watching each day to see the dear new sprouts come up, is like taking a hand in creation, I think. Just now my garden is like faith, the substance of things hoped for. But bide a wee. It always amazes me to look at the little wrinkled brown seeds and think of the rainbows in 'em," said Captain Jim. "When I ponder on them seeds I don't find it nowise hard to believe that we've got souls that'll live in other worlds. You couldn't hardly believe there was life in them tiny things, some no bigger than grains of dust, let alone color and scent, if you hadn't seen the miracle, could you?" Anne, who was counting her days like silver beads on a rosary, could not now take the long walk to the lighthouse or up the Glen road. But Miss Cornelia and Captain Jim came very often to the little house. Miss Cornelia was the joy of Anne's and Gilbert's existence. They laughed side-splittingly over her speeches after every visit. When Captain Jim and she happened to visit the little house at the same time, there was much sport for the listening. They waged wordy warfare, she attacking, he defending. Anne once reproached the captain for his baiting of Miss Cornelia. "Oh, I do love to set her going, Mistress Blythe," chuckled the unrepentant sinner. "It's the greatest amusement I have in life. That tongue of hers would blister a stone. And you and that young dog of a doctor enjoy listening to her as much as I do." Captain Jim came along another evening to bring Anne some mayflowers. The garden was full of the moist, scented air of a maritime spring evening. There was a milk-white mist on the edge of the sea, with the young moon kissing it, and a silver gladness of stars over the Glen. The bell of the church across the harbor was ringing dreamily sweet. The mellow chime drifted through the dusk to mingle with the soft spring moan of the sea. Captain Jim's mayflowers added the last completing touch to the charm of the night. "I haven't seen any this spring and I've missed them," said Anne, burying her face in them. "They ain't to be found around Four Winds, only in the barrens away behind the Glen up yonder. I took a little trip today to the land of nothing to do and hunted these up for you. I reckon they're the last you'll see this spring, for they're nearly done." "How kind and thoughtful you are, Captain Jim. Nobody else, not even Gilbert," with a shake of her head at him, "remembered that I always long for mayflowers in the spring." "Well, I had another errand, too. I wanted to take Mr. Howard back yonder a mess of trout. He likes one occasional, and it's all I can do for a kindness he did me once. I stayed all the afternoon and talked to him. He likes to talk to me, though he's a highly educated man and I'm only an ignorant old sailor, because he's one of the folks that's got to talk, or they're miserable, and he finds listeners scarce round here. The Glen folks might shy of him because they think he's an infidel. He ain't that far gone exactly. Few men is, I reckon. But he's what you might call a heretic. Heretics are wicked, but they're mighty interesting. It's just that they've got sort of lost looking for God, being under the impression that he's hard to find, which he ain't never. Most of 'em blunder to him after a while, I guess. I don't think listening to Mr. Howard's arguments is likely to do me much harm. Mind you, I believe what I was brought up to believe. It saves a vast bother. And back of it all, God is good. The trouble with Mr. Howard is that he's a little too clever. He thinks that he's bound to live up to his cleverness, and that it's smarter to thrash out some new way of getting to heaven than to go by the old track the common ignorant folks is traveling. But he'll get there sometime, all right, and then he'll laugh at himself." "Mr. Howard was a Methodist to begin with," said Miss Cornelia, as if she thought he had not far to go from that to heresy. "Do you know, Cornelia," said Captain Jim gravely, "I've often thought that if I wasn't a Presbyterian I'd be a Methodist." "Oh, well," conceded Miss Cornelia, "if you weren't a Presbyterian it wouldn't matter much what you were. Speaking of heresy reminds me, Doctor, I've brought back that book you lent me, that Natural Law in the Spiritual World. I didn't read more'n a word of it. I can read sense and I can read nonsense, but that book is neither the one nor the other." "It is considered rather heretical in some quarters," admitted Gilbert. "But I told you that before you took it, Miss Cornelia." "Oh, I wouldn't have minded its being heretical. I can stand wickedness, but I can't stand foolishness," said Miss Cornelia calmly, and with the air of having said the last thing there was to say about natural law. "Speaking of books, a mad love come to an end at last 2 weeks ago," remarked Captain Jim musingly. "It run to 103 chapters. When they got married the book stopped right off, so I reckon their troubles were all over. It's real nice that that's the way in books anyhow, isn't it, even if 'tisn't so anywhere else?" "I never read novels," said Miss Cornelia. "Did you hear how Geordie Russell was today, Captain Jim?" "Yes, I called in on my way home to see him. He's getting around all right, but stewing in a broth of trouble as usual, poor man. Course he brews up most of it for himself, but I reckon that don't make it any easier to bear. He's an awful pessimist." "Well, no, he ain't a pessimist exactly, Cornelia. He only just never finds anything that suits him." "And isn't that a pessimist?" "No, no. A pessimist is one who never expects to find anything to suit him. Geordie ain't got that far yet." "You'd find something good to say of the devil himself, Jim Boyd." "Well, you've heard the story of the old lady who said he was persevering. But no, Cornelia, I've nothing good to say of the devil." "Do you believe in him at all?" asked Miss Cornelia seriously. "How can you ask that when you know what a good Presbyterian I am, Cornelia? How could a Presbyterian get along without a devil?" "Do you?" persisted Miss Cornelia. Captain Jim suddenly became grave. "I believe in what I heard a minister once call a mighty and malignant and intelligent power of evil working in the universe," he said solemnly. "I do that, Cornelia. You can call it the devil, or the principle of evil, or the old scratch, or any name you like. It's there, and all the infidels and heretics in the world can't argue it away, any more'n they can argue God away. It's there, and it's working. But mind you, Cornelia, I believe it's going to get the worst of it in the long run." "I'm sure I hope so," said Miss Cornelia, none too hopefully. "But speaking of the devil, I am positive that Billy Booth is possessed by him now. Have you heard of Billy's latest performance?" "No. What was that?" "He's gone and burned up his wife's new brown broadcloth suit that she paid $25 for in Charlottetown, because he declares the men looked too admiring at her when she wore it to church the first time. Wasn't that like a man?" "Mistress Booth is mighty pretty, and brown's her color," said Captain Jim reflectively. "Is that any good reason why he should poke her new suit into the kitchen stove? Billy Booth is a jealous fool, and he makes his wife's life miserable. She's cried all the week about her suit. Oh, Anne, I wish I could write like you, believe me. Wouldn't I score some of the men around here?" "Those Booths are all a mite queer," said Captain Jim. "Billy seemed the sanest of the lot till he got married, and then this queer jealous streak cropped out in him. His brother Daniel, now, was always odd. Took tantrums every few days or so and wouldn't get out of bed," said Miss Cornelia with a relish. "His wife would have to do all the barn work till he got over his spell. When he died people wrote her letters of condolence. If I'd written anything it would have been one of congratulation. Their father, old Abram Booth, was a disgusting old sot. He was drunk at his wife's funeral and kept reeling round and hiccuping, 'I didn't drink much, but I feel awfully queer.' I gave him a good jab in the back with my umbrella when he came near me, and it sobered him up until they got the casket out of the house. Young Johnny Booth was to have been married yesterday, but he couldn't be because he's gone and got the mumps. Wasn't that like a man?" "How could he help getting the mumps, poor fellow?" "I'd poor fellow him, believe me, if I was Kate Stearns. I don't know how he could help getting the mumps, but I do know the wedding supper was all prepared and everything will be spoiled before he's well again. Such a waste. He should have had the mumps when he was a boy." Come, Cornelia, don't you think you're a mite unreasonable?" Miss Cornelia disdained to reply, and turned instead to Susan Baker, a grim-faced, kind-hearted elderly spinster of the Glen, who had been installed as a maid-of-all-work at the little house for some weeks. Susan had been up to the Glen to make a sick call and had just returned. "How is poor old Aunt Mandy tonight?" asked Miss Cornelia. Susan sighed. Very poorly, Cornelia. I'm afraid she will soon be in heaven, poor thing." "Oh, surely it's not so bad as that," exclaimed Miss Cornelia sympathetically. Captain Jim and Gilbert looked at each other. Then they suddenly rose and went out. "There are times," said Captain Jim between spasms, "when it would be a sin not to laugh. Them two excellent women." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Dawn and Dusk. In early June, when the sand hills were a great glory of pink wild roses and the glen was smothered in apple blossoms, Marilla arrived at the little house, accompanied by a black horsehair trunk patterned with brass nails, which had reposed undisturbed in the Green Gables garret for half a century. Susan Baker, who during her few weeks' sojourn in the little house had come to worship young Mrs. Doctor, as she called Anne, with blind fervor, looked rather jealously askance at Marilla at first. But as Marilla did not try to interfere in kitchen matters, and showed no desire to interrupt Susan's ministrations to young Mrs. Doctor, the good handmaiden became reconciled to her presence, and told her cronies at the Glen that Miss Cuthbert was a fine old lady and knew her place. One evening, when the sky's limpid bowl was filled with a red glory, and the robins were thrilling the golden twilight with jubilant hymns to the stars of evening, there was a sudden commotion in the little house of dreams. Telephone messages were sent up to the Glen. Dr. Dave and a white-capped nurse came hastily down. Marilla paced the garden walks between the quahog shells, murmuring prayers between her set lips, and Susan sat in the kitchen with cotton wool in her ears and her apron over her head. Leslie, looking out from the house up the brook, saw that every window of the little house was alight, and did not sleep that night. The June night was short, but it seemed an eternity to those who waited and watched. "Oh, will it never end?" said Marilla. Then she saw how grave the nurse and Dr. Dave looked, and she dared ask no more questions. Suppose Anne— But Marilla could not suppose it. "Do not tell me," said Susan fiercely, answering the anguish in Marilla's eyes, "that God could be so cruel as to take that darling lamb for us when we all love her so much." "He has taken others as well, beloved," said Marilla hoarsely. But at dawn, when the rising sun rent apart the mists hanging over the sandbar and made rainbows of them, joy came to the little house. Anne was safe, and a wee white lady with her mother's big eyes was lying beside her. Gilbert, his face gray and haggard from his night's agony, came down to tell Marilla and Susan. "Thank God," shuddered Marilla. Susan got up and took the cotton wool out of her ears. "Now for breakfast," she said briskly. "I am of the opinion that we will all be glad of a bite and sup. You tell young Mrs. Doctor not to worry about a single thing. Susan is at the helm. You tell her just to think of her baby." Gilbert smiled rather sadly as he went away. Anne, her pale face blanched with its baptism of pain, her eyes aglow with the holy passion of motherhood, did not need to be told to think of her baby. She thought of nothing else. For a few hours she tasted of happiness so rare and exquisite that she wondered if the angels in heaven did not envy her. "Little Joyce," she murmured when Marilla came in to see the baby. "We planned to call her that if she were a girlie. There were so many we would have liked to name her for. We couldn't choose between them, so we decided on Joyce. We can call her Joy for short. Joy. It suits so well. Oh, Marilla, I thought I was happy before. Now I know that I just dreamed a pleasant dream of happiness. This is the reality." "You mustn't talk, Anne. Wait till you're stronger," said Marilla warningly. "You know how hard it is for me not to talk," smiled Anne. At first she was too weak and too happy to notice that Gilbert and the nurse looked grave and Marilla sorrowful. Then, as subtly and coldly and remorselessly as a sea fog stealing landward, fear crept into her heart. Why was not Gilbert gladder? Why would he not talk about the baby? Why would they not let her have it with her after that first heavenly, happy hour? Was there anything wrong? "Gilbert," whispered Anne imploringly, "the baby is all right, isn't she? Tell me. Tell me." Gilbert was a long while in turning round. Then he bent over Anne and looked in her eyes. Marilla, listening fearfully outside the door, heard a pitiful, heartbroken moan and fled to the kitchen where Susan was weeping. "Oh, the poor lamb, the poor lamb! How can she bear it, Miss Cuthbert? I am afraid it will kill her. She has been that built up and happy, longing for that baby and planning for it. Cannot anything be done nohow, Miss Cuthbert?" "I'm afraid not, Susan. Gilbert says there is no hope. He knew from the first the little thing couldn't live." "And it is such a sweet baby," sobbed Susan. "I never saw one so white. They're mostly red or yellow. And it opened its big eyes as if it was months old. The little thing. Oh, the poor young Mrs. Doctor." At sunset the little soul that had come with the dawning went away, leaving heartbreak behind it. Miss Cornelia took the wee white lady from the kindly but stranger hands of the nurse, and dressed the tiny waxen form in the beautiful dress Leslie had made for it. Leslie had asked her to do that. Then she took it back and laid it beside the poor, broken, tear-blinded little mother. "The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away, dearie," she said through her own tears. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Then she went away, leaving Anne and Gilbert alone together with their dead. The next day the small white joy was laid in a velvet casket which Leslie had lined with apple blossoms, and taken to the graveyard of the church across the harbor. Miss Cornelia and Marilla put all the little love-made garments away, together with the ruffled basket which had been befrilled and belaced for dimpled limbs and downy head. Little Joy was never to sleep there. She had found a colder, narrower bed. "This has been an awful disappointment to me," sighed Miss Cornelia. "I've looked forward to this baby, and I did want it to be a girl, too." "I can only be thankful that Anne's life was spared," said Marilla with a shiver, recalling those hours of darkness when the girl she loved was passing through the valley of the shadow. "Poor, poor lamb, her heart is broken," said Susan. "I envy Anne," said Leslie suddenly and fiercely. "And I'd envy her even if she had died. She was a mother for one beautiful day. I'd gladly give my life for that." "I wouldn't talk like that, Leslie, dearie," said Miss Cornelia deprecatingly. She was afraid that the dignified Miss Cuthbert would think Leslie quite terrible. Anne's convalescence was long and made bitter for her by many things. The bloom and sunshine of the Four Winds world grated harshly on her, and yet when the rain fell heavily she pictured it beating so mercilessly down on that little grave across the harbor. And when the wind blew around the eaves she heard sad voices in it that she had never heard before. Kindly callers heard her too, with the well-meant platitudes with which they strove to cover the nakedness of bereavement. A letter from Phil Blake was an added sting. Phil had heard of the baby's birth, but not of its death, and she wrote Anne a congratulatory letter of sweet mirth which hurt her horribly. "I would have laughed over it so happily if I had my baby," she sobbed to Marilla. "But when I haven't it just seems like wanton cruelty, though I know Phil wouldn't hurt me for the world. Oh, Marilla, I don't see how I can ever be happy again. Everything will hurt me all the rest of my life." "Time will help you," said Marilla, who was racked with sympathy but could never learn to express it in other than age-worn formulas. "It doesn't seem fair," said Anne rebelliously. "Babies are born and live where they are not wanted, where they will be neglected, where they will have no chance. I would have loved my baby so, and cared for it so tenderly, and tried to give her every chance for good, and yet I wasn't allowed to keep her." "It was God's will, Anne," said Marilla, helpless before the riddle of the universe, the why of undeserved pain. "And little Joy is better off." "I can't believe that," cried Anne bitterly. Then, seeing that Marilla looked shocked, she added passionately, "Why should she be born at all? Why should anyone be born at all if she's better off dead? I don't believe it is better for a child to die at birth than to live its life out, and love and be loved, and enjoy and suffer and do its work, and develop a character that would give it a personality in eternity. And how do you know that it was God's will? Perhaps it was just a thwarting of his purpose by the power of evil. We can't be expected to be resigned to that." "Oh, Anne, don't talk so," said Marilla, genuinely alarmed lest Anne were drifting into deep and dangerous waters. "We can't understand, but we must have faith. We must believe that all is for the best. I know you find it hard to think so just now, but try to be brave, for Gilbert's sake. He's so worried about you. You aren't getting strong as fast as you should." "Oh, I know I've been very selfish," sighed Anne. "I love Gilbert more than ever, and I want to live for his sake, but it seems as if part of me was buried over there in that little harbor graveyard, and it hurts so much that I'm afraid of life." "It won't hurt so much always, Anne." "The thought that it may stop hurting sometimes hurts me worse than all else, Marilla." "Yes, I know. I've felt that too about other things. But we all love you, Anne. Captain Jim has been up every day to ask for you, and Mrs. Moore haunts the place, and Miss Bryant spends most of her time, I think, cooking up nice things for you. Susan doesn't like it very well. She thinks she can cook as well as Miss Bryant. Dear Susan. Oh, everybody has been so dear and good and lovely to me, Marilla. I'm not ungrateful. And perhaps, when this horrible ache grows a little less, I'll find that I can go on living." End of chapter 19.